But all of Emerson's perspectives on nature were grounded in New England. A trip out west was probably impossible for him to fathom. But that would all change. At age 67, Emerson felt depleted after delivering 3, tough lectures at Harvard College. And so he was invited by a friend of his to recuperate up in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. Emerson declined, too fatigued to travel, just up to New Hampshire. But a few months later, this same friend insisted that Emerson join about a dozen others on this magnificent journey across the country, reaching the fabled West. Well, that western landscape that he'd heard about must have held some incredible allure for him, because Emerson did accept the invitation to go out west. And so on April 4th, 1871, now that's just 20 years before our church took root here, the entourage with Emerson in tow they'd made it to Chicago then, left Chicago in a Pullman train. And Emerson was in fine form, undoubtedly fueled by the excitement and sheer power and promise of the West. This group arrived in San Francisco on April 21st, and Emerson wrote about viewing the Pacific and watching the sea lions play in San Francisco Bay from the vantage point of the Cliff House, which still remains a tourist trap even today. How many have been to the Cliff House? How many wish they never would? No. It's nice. It's nice. But in all my years in this church, not once has anyone ever mentioned the historic meeting between Ralph Waldo Emerson and Brigham Young as the train stopped in Salt Lake City on April 19th, 1871. Emerson wrote about that experience in a letter that he sent back to Boston. Allow me to quote a part of Emerson's letter upon meeting Brigham Young. This is what he said. On our way out, we visited Salt Lake City. I called on Brigham Young, who received us with a quiet, uncommitting courtesy at first. A strong-built, self-professed, sufficient man with plain manners. Our interview was peaceable enough and rather mended my impression of the man. He is clearly a sufficient ruler and perhaps civilizer of his kingdom of blockheads. Not one of Emerson's most eloquent moments, but he just put it out there. Emerson's journey to California also included a bit of business. He wanted to establish ties with a fellow there by the name of Ezra Carr, who Emerson hoped would actually edit Thoreau's journals. I don't know whether or not that ever happened. I don't think it did. But what's important is that Emerson met Jean Carr, who was Ezra's wife. And she was good friends with a 31-year-old sort of wild fellow who lived and worked in Yosemite Valley. You know who I'm talking about. John Muir, who earlier had walked from Indiana to Florida, creating botanical sketches as he went, then sailed to California, walked from San Francisco to the Sierra Nevada, and it was during that trek that he decided to simply surrender his life to nature. Jean Carr told Emerson that John Muir was one of his spiritual sons. And so Emerson and Muir finally met, and although Emerson thought Muir looked a little peculiar, though harmless, Emerson rolled with it all, having had experiences with the peculiar, namely in the guise of Henry David Thoreau. So I think if you deal with Henry David Thoreau, you can deal with anybody that you meet. For 2 days, John Muir, if you could just imagine this, these two giants together. John Muir showed a revived Ralph Waldo Emerson the exquisite beauty of Yosemite Valley. And then Muir invited Emerson to camp with him under the stars. Unfortunately, Emerson's friends thought that the camping excursion with Muir was too risky for Emerson's health, and thus Emerson sadly declined and continued his travels on the next day. So with Emerson now gone, Muir returned to the heart of the grove, made a bed of sequoia plumes and fern, then gathered wood for a fire. And he wrote in his journal, "Though lonesome for the first time in these forests, I quickly took heart again. The trees had not gone to Boston, nor the birds. And as I sit by the fire, Emerson is still with me in spirit." 40 years after their historic meeting, Muir described Emerson as follows: "Emerson was the most serene, majestic, sequoia-like soul I ever met. His smile was as sweet and calm as the morning light on mountains. A tremendous sincerity was his." Well, back then, as Emerson had to say goodbye to John Muir and he descended the western slope of the Sierra to return to Concord, he said to his traveling companions in reference to John Muir, "Now there's a young man from whom we shall hear." Emerson's words were prophetic. 10 years after Emerson's death, which will put us now at 1892, so this church was already launched. 10 years after Emerson's death, the dispute over best use of public lands clearly became a contentious battle, one which engages us still today. Now, after Congress enacted that Forest Preserve Act, two opposing views emerged in articulating exactly what should be permitted in those forest preserves. The utilitarian and conservationist view was led by Gifford Pinchot, a Yale graduate who studied forestry overseas and was the first American to declare himself a professional forester. The other view was expressed by John Muir, who by 1896 had emerged as a leading preservationist and who considered forests as sacred. He wanted forests treated as parks, thereby prohibiting logging, grazing, hunting. This idea clashed fiercely with Pinchot, who believed that the best way to protect forests was to manage their use, not leave them alone. Pinchot's style of conservation was favored by both Congress and President Grover Cleveland. Pinchot was appointed the nation's chief forester, and national forest became part of the Department of Agriculture, where it still finds itself today. The mindset, let's think about just what's going on in their psyches, and the mindset of treating the forest as something to be used and managed like a crop, unlike Muir's view that they be preserved like a temple, set the prototype for how the environmental battle lines are drawn even today. Now, in the earlier part of the 20th century, so you got the conservationists, the preservationists, but in the early part of the new century, a third position was launched on how to use the land. It varied widely from both conservationism and environmentalism. It adopted a laissez-faire attitude that held that owners of private property, including lumber and mining companies, should be allowed to do anything they wished with their land. It feels like Utah has not progressed much in mind and spirit these past 100 years. The conservationists, led by Teddy Roosevelt and Gifford Pinchot, argued for a long-term plan to maximize the economic benefits of natural resources. Environmentalism, led by John Muir, adhered to the position of nature as sacred, and that man was an intruder. He vehemently announced the dams that Roosevelt supported for water supplies and electricity, especially the Hetch Hetchy Dam in Yosemite National Park, which would supply San Francisco with water. Conflicts over the best use of public lands remain the hot-button issues in the American West today. At 123 years of age, First Unitarian Church finds itself just in the middle of the fighting of what is the best use of the land and how do we preserve our open spaces. Reimagining the West has, I truly believe, become part of this church's spiritual mission. Rather than treating public lands as an energy resource for, traditional fossil fuels like oil, gas, and coal, First Unitarian Church is dogmatic in its insistence upon renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and geothermal. Our position is that by protecting public lands and open spaces, we can secure breathtaking scenery, functioning ecosystems, wilderness, and a variety of flora and fauna threatened by extinction. And the brief video on the reintroduction of wolves in Yellowstone reflect, I think, how little we human merely beings fully comprehend the interconnectedness of all of life. We are humbled, I believe, by the majesty of nature's sacredness. And now we move on to this very difficult period of time, and that is, it has finally sunk in that climate change is indeed a reality. And that reality is the biggest issue this congregation has ever had to face. As the lives of our children and grandchildren are definitely, seriously threatened. And we must join a wider movement in reimagining land use, at least here in the West. That's our job. We must keep fossil fuels in the ground and protect our forests that offset the emissions of greenhouse gases. This church, by virtue of being situated in the West, is deeply committed to eco-justice. And I think we understand our mission well, to serve the West as moral exemplars for an environmentally sustainable world. What's so remarkable is that even though this institution's been around 123 years, we remain forward-looking. We are clear in our vision of what must transpire and how we need to serve as a midwife to a new era of political will, self-discipline, and gaining this profound appreciation for the web of all of life. This church responds as though this were a sacred calling of ours, and it is, to reimagine a West that offers renewable energy sources and to preserve natural life upon our planet. After 123 years, it feels like our work has just begun. But what an amazing repository of movements and passion and justice seeking that we have now to fuel us forward. And let us, in fact, move forward with all our hearts.